Welcome to Lincoln Fire and Rescue. I'm Dale Johnson. Following the shootings of Columbine in 1999 and other incidents that have taken place in this country, police response to active shooter incidents, we'll call them ASI, the situations have undergone a paradigm shift for law enforcement officials. In most law enforcement agencies, personnel are trained to respond aggressively, to immediately pursue, establish with, contact, and then neutralize the shooter or the threat of the situation. So rapid response and threat removal result in fewer casualties. However, emergency medical services, that's EMS, response to the active shooter situations in most areas has not followed paradigm shifts as quickly. The EMS response to the active shooter was to stage in a secure location until police mitigate the threat and secure the area. But unfortunately, as a result of this procedure, securing such a complex scene can take hours. And as a result, people were dying inside the active shooter situation. So today we're going to talk about how public safety agencies around the country and here in Lincoln have changed their protocol, their policies, their procedures, and have changed training that would allow EMS to team up with law enforcement in active shooter situations. And to focus on an example of this today in Lincoln is Lincoln Fire and Rescue Captain Rick Schneider, and from the Lincoln Police Department, Captain Ryan Dale. Captain Dale, Captain Schneider, thank you.
Thank
you very much for coming in. So I want to turn to you first, Captain Schneider, because of the EMS element of all this. Okay. Paramedics respond to thousands of calls every year in Lincoln. But an active shooter situation is totally different. There's danger, there's a threat. So I'm interested to know what paramedic training, what additional training is necessary to react to this type of situation.
Individually, the training's not very different. The goal is to stop the bleeding, rapid transport, triage multiple patients, get them to the hospital. As an agency or many crews working together to be able to work with law enforcement to go into the scene, get to those patients and to get access to them quicker. Does make a difference in their outcomes. We're able to get in there, stop the bleeding, prevent shock, and make a difference in their outcomes.
That's once you're inside.
Right.
I've followed paramedics into medical situations, and it's casual, it's professional. You're standing upright, you're walking in, you're asking people who are there, helping you at the door, those sorts of things. I envision an active shooter situation, though, where you're protecting yourself while getting access to the scene. Is that a fair thinking on my part?
To a point. We work with law enforcement, partnering up with them, going into an area where it's considered the warm zone, where there's not a lot of a direct threat. There's potential, but not that direct immediate threat right there. We're able to go in, triage, treat some patients immediately, and remove them out to a triage area where we can provide more care, triage and put them in ambulances and get them to the hospital where they need to be.
So the training comes from the time you pull up on scene, the additional training. Mm-hmm. Jump in, correct me if I'm wrong. The additional training, once you get to the scene, you do what you know how to do, right? Stop the bleed, save lives, transport, get into a medical facility.
The difference is both agencies working together to be able to do that. Work with law enforcement, partnering up, a couple of our Lincoln Fire people, a couple of Lincoln police officers going into that warm zone and making access to them that way. So law enforcement's still dealing with the threat, but we're coming in behind them to get to the wounded and the victims.
Now, Captain Dale, what's your thinking and officer thinking process? Because now you've got a paramedic alongside you or near you entering the warm zone that you wouldn't have to have thought about in prior procedures.
I think the most important factor is that there's a good line of communication between the police officers and the firefighters or paramedics. We don't normally operate on the same radio frequencies. We don't use the same radio codes, the same terms. So that's where training together and practicing this and learning in controlled environment is so important, so that if the real thing happens, we're able to communicate and have a common understanding of what we're trying to accomplish as a group.
Do you go as so far as to, and maybe I'm getting too deep into this, but do you go so far as to start to think like a paramedic or what a paramedic might have to do? And do you as a paramedic think what a law enforcement official has to do? Or do you not go that far?
I don't think we probably go that far. I think especially under that extreme of stress, the police officer's gonna be focused on what their role is. In this case, if we're talking about a rescue task force, the police officer's responsibility, if they're with the paramedics, is to provide them protection so they can get to the victims to treat them.
You use the term warm zone, Captain Schneider. Where is that in an ASI situation?
Somewhere outside where that area, that direct threat might be it, you know, somebody with a gun, somebody barricaded in somewhere, somebody still, an area that hasn't been searched in a building, somewhere where law enforcement owns the territory and we're able to go in and while they're looking at security, we're able to focus on patient care and treatment right there. So,
how many paramedics in Lincoln would be receiving this type of training? All of them?
yes.
Every paramedic in the system would be trained in this. How about law enforcement?
Everyone. We first had our big training on this, I think in 2016. At that time we trained about 15 dispatchers, 300 police officers, and I think about 100 paramedics and firefighters. And since then, we've continued to catch those few people that weren't able to attend that training, and it's continued through our academies and whatnot.
You bring up another element, dispatch. I hadn't factored in dispatch and their learning curve
Right.
through all this. They're dealing with 2 agencies now, correct?
They're dealing with 2 agencies. They're dealing with a massive amount of phone calls. They could be getting dozens, if not hundreds, of phone calls all at one time. And they're great at multitasking to begin with, but it certainly would stretch their resources pretty quick. So when we do training, we actually start right from the get-go and include dispatch in the training by having the staged callers to start calling the dispatchers that are participating in the training to report the active shooter incident. Maybe even throw them some curveballs, some misinformation, which would be realistic under a stressful environment where callers might be giving conflicting information. So hopefully it tests those dispatchers and gives them some practice reps as well.
Does this require additional medical supplies or tools in your bag?
Not really. We've have a little go bag, something smaller. When we show up on a medical response, we carry probably about 40 to 50 pounds of gear on your average medical. Moving a little faster, traveling a little lighter. We've got a couple different things, but the equipment's basically the same what we use every day.
Drawing upon your military experience, and thank you for committing yourself to military experience, Captain Schneider, how does that help you compared to someone who doesn't have your skill set from the military?
I think it's helped a lot. I bring a lot of things from the military side of the house, the studies, the training, the care for wounded. Several years ago, a group of people came together, decided that looking at pattern injuries from combat to pattern injuries from active shooter type incidents are very, very similar. So bringing the experience from dealing with those kinds of wounds back here and able to help train and teach and the providers here in Lincoln has been a benefit for patients.
Captain Dale, how do you, maybe I'm overthinking this, but how do you think about not getting in the way? I mean, I don't know what responsibilities you have been trained to do when you walk into a warm zone, when you walk into an active shooter situation. Are you aware of how far you should go and when you should stop?
I think some of that probably falls into the subconscious area, where some of that, after practicing with each other, is probably just a natural reaction on how close you need to stick together, very close. There could be fire alarms going off, people screaming, all sorts of chaos, and it'd be very easy to split up if you're not within inches of each other as you move through a building. And then obviously there has to be communication. If the paramedics stop to triage someone, the officers need to stay with them to provide
That was going to be my next
protection.
question. Are you there too to protect paramedics in a situation like that too?
Absolutely, because if we don't protect the paramedics, then they aren't able to get the rapid treatment to the victims, and we could have additional casualties simply because of blood loss.
Do you have extra equipment? I mentioned your kit, but I mean as far as what you wear. Do you walk into a ASI situation looking the same way you do as you would walk into a cardiac event?
Right now, yes. We've tried to secure funding for body armor, ballistic helmets, a couple different ways, and both times have been unsuccessful. A lot of priorities across the city, and a couple federal grants have been denied. So we're still working on doing that. We're still going to make entry. We're still going to come in and do what we can to help out any victims.
This is fairly new. As I've tried to find a list of states, and from what I've been able to find, it's less than a dozen. Fewer than a dozen states have really latched onto this and have taken on ownership of a program like this.
Right, and I think it's just come about within the last few years. I think when we were trying to start the program here, there were a few other states or cities at least that were trying to implement similar things, but it's gradually becoming more widespread.
Mm-hmm. It's called the Active Shooter Rescue Task Force Program, RTF. I started off by talking about the cooperation, and maybe those of us here in Lincoln, we tend to take that for granted.
Mm-hmm.
But the three of us know, working in the agencies and in the media, know that this just doesn't happen by accident.
Mm-hmm.
It takes work. There are territorial egos sometimes in other jurisdictions and metropolitan areas that you got to get over that in order for a process like this and cooperation to work. Why don't you talk about the fact that police cooperates with fire and fire cooperates with police. Plus, let's bring in sheriff. Sheriff sometimes comes in, university police come in, we have the state patrol. You got a lot of different agencies all blending together, and it seems to work in Nebraska.
Yeah. Each agency has its own priorities, own responsibilities, but the importance comes in spending time together, talking things out in advance, so that when a real situation happens, you're not trying something for the first time. You need to spend time with each other in advance, so you understand each other's roles and develop a respect for what responsibilities everyone involved has.
How often is training necessary, Captain Schneider? Because there are fires every day. There are medical calls every day. You get plenty of practice doing those. But an active shooter situation, let's knock on this table. We haven't had one here.
Right. Well, we can always do more training. We can always improve ourselves. We can always practice on how we're going to operate and look to improve things. So working between the agencies, I think, is something that's vital. And with Lincoln Police, we're kind of ahead of the game from a lot of other agencies around the state and across the country that we're ahead of where we are. So, working with UNLPD, the Sheriff's Office, we've done exercises and drills with both those agencies also. And it helps on the day-to-day calls and something that would be larger, more involved.
We started by mentioning dispatch. That's the first line of this whole conversation. Mm-hmm. Let's look at the other end, the hospitals, the emergency rooms, and the facilities that we have in town. How are they involved in all of this?
Well, Bryan Hospitals participated on the front end of this program by providing training to all of the police department on bleeding control and the use of tourniquets. So we have that resource now, not only for active shooter situations, but for other isolated situations. But I think they practice as well their procedures when a major incident happens where they're going to have a mass amount of victims coming in. I was actually at Bryan West when there was an active shooter incident a few years ago at a facility outside of Crete, and they ended up not getting as many people as they were expecting, but it was really amazing to watch how fast they came together, and without even talking to each other, everyone knew what each other were doing, and it was really impressive how fast they were ready for those people to be flown there.
Well, how long has this been underway? How long has this program been in existence? I just learned about it 5-6 months ago.
Probably about 3 years.
I think so. We've been working together on this for about 3.5 years, training both agencies cooperatively, and what we can do and how I can help you, how you can help me, and get to know the other agencies. It's been a benefit both on something potentially big and on the everyday calls.
What would do us in the media would be a good lesson is to learn how to report from something like this. There's a skill set that we haven't had to practice and we haven't set into motion yet. So it would behoove us to be able to know how to not get in the way, so to speak. So we might take that on as a media organization. It would behoove us to do that. Thank you, Captain Dale, very much.
Thank you.
And thank you for being a Lincoln police officer. Captain Schneider, thank you.
Thank
being
you.
on LFR, doing what you do every day. And thanks everybody for listening to us today on Lincoln Fire and Rescue.